For centuries, humanity has looked at representations of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ through the lens of art and devotion. Renaissance paintings, Gothic stained glass, Baroque sculptures have shaped our vision of the central event of Christianity. But for one man of science, those images did not add up. Dr. Pierre Barbet had no theological training. He was a simple chief surgeon at St. Joseph Hospital in Paris, a man accustomed to the precision of anatomy and the raw reality of the human body. In the course of his research, he was struck by the complete absence of detailed medical investigation into the physical suffering of Jesus on the cross. When he looked at the crucifixes in churches, something troubled his clinical eye. From a medical standpoint, those images appeared anatomically impossible. A body nailed through the palms of the hands would not remain on the cross as depicted in paintings and sculptures. The tissue would tear within minutes. Driven by an honest search for truth, Pierre began his investigation. A chief surgeon in Paris, Dr. Pierre Barbet set out to describe in precise medical terms the suffering of the crucified Christ. He studied how crucifixion was practiced by the Romans and what ancient authors wrote about the agony of Jesus. He conducted experiments, studied the Shroud of Turin, and applied the laws of physics and biology to the biblical account. He even traced the history of crucifixion in art, searching for details in ancient images that might help him understand the Passion more completely. What he discovered revealed dimensions of human suffering that even the Vatican had never catalogued with such precision. Details that humanized the sacrifice and showed that behind the article of faith, there was a man confronting the absolute limit of physical pain. When Barbet presented his findings to the then Cardinal Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XI, the Cardinal admitted with sorrow, "We did not know. No one ever told us this." But how does science explain the sweating of blood? What happens to a nerve when a nail is driven through it? And how was it possible that, on the verge of asphyxiation, Jesus was still able to speak? You will find out in this video about the Passion of Christ through the eyes of medicine. Our journey begins at Calvary, in the silence of the Mount of Olives. The Bible recounts that, as Jesus entered his agony, he sweated blood. For many modern critics, this is nothing more than poetic license, a metaphor for suffering. But for Dr. Pierre and for modern medicine, this phenomenon has a name, called hematidrosis. It is an exceedingly rare clinical condition, nonetheless real. It occurs under conditions of extreme psychological stress, a terror so overwhelming that the nervous system enters a state of collapse. What happens technically is the dilation and rupture of capillary vessels beneath the sweat glands. Blood mingles with sweat and seeps through the pores. But the physical consequences extend far beyond the dramatic image. Barbet explains that this condition causes a scaling of the epidermis. The skin becomes extraordinarily sensitive, soft, and raw. Now consider what this meant for what was to follow. When the Roman soldiers began the flagellation, the body of Jesus was no longer an ordinary body. It was a body with the skin already worn away, where every touch, every friction of clothing, or even the subtlest physical contact produced the most excruciating pain. Science shows us that Jesus arrived at the pillar of flagellation already in a state of fragility and physical exhaustion, which would make the next stages humanly unsurvivable. The suffering of Christ began in the sweat, transforming his body into an open wound before the first strike of the whip had even fallen. Roman flagellation was an engineering of pain. The instrument used was the flagrum, a multi-tailed whip of leather straps, each fitted with pieces of sharpened bone or metal. Designed to inflict deep lacerations and severe hemorrhage, this instrument of torture was intended to debilitate the condemned before crucifixion. Dr. Pierre describes how the blows penetrated into the deeper muscle layers. During the scourging, the metal balls caused internal contusions and hematomas, while the sharpened bones tore away flesh. Barbet also studied the Shroud of Turin in forensic detail. The markings visible on the cloth can be traced across the shoulders, the back, the kidneys, and the chest. At this stage, the physician identifies the onset of hypovolemic shock, a critical medical emergency caused by severe blood and fluid loss. The heart begins to pump faster to compensate for the drop in blood pressure. Thirst becomes desperate and unrelenting. When Jesus is forced to carry the crossbeam, weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, he does so across shoulders that no longer bear skin, but exposed flesh. Every step toward Calvary was a test of physical endurance that medicine can barely explain how any human being could survive. After the flagellation, the soldiers placed a crown of thorns on the head of Jesus. Common in the region of Palestine, the plant used was the Spina Christi, its thorns long, sharp and curved. This was not a circlet, as it is typically depicted in art. It took the form of a helmet, covering the entire skull. The thorns penetrated the scalp, an area of extreme sensitivity, one that also bleeds profusely. Within moments, the entire skull was matted with coagulated blood. And then came the nails. It was here that Dr. Pierre introduced his most scientifically consequential finding. The nails were not driven through the palms of the hands. They were driven through the wrists, because nails through the palms would cause the hands to tear completely under the weight of the body. Barbet identified the point he called the space of Destot, located in the wrist, between the carpal bones. When driven through this point, the iron nail did not fracture the bones. Instead, it did something far worse. It crushed the median nerve. For a surgeon like Pierre, this was the apex of torture. The median nerve governs sensation and movement in the hand. When it is struck in this manner, the pain is described as a searing electric shock that radiates up the entire arm. The hand contracts into a paralyzed claw, which is precisely why, on the Shroud of Turin, the thumbs of Christ are not visible. They were drawn inward to the palm as a result of the nerve injury. Jesus was now fixed to the cross, but his greatest enemy was gravity. Barbet then arrives at the most dramatic conclusion of his entire investigation. Crucifixion is, in its essence, death by asphyxiation. Suspended by the arms, the muscles of the thorax enter a state of permanent spasm. The lungs can inhale, but they cannot exhale. Carbon dioxide begins to accumulate in the blood, generating metabolic acidosis and an unrelenting sensation of imminent suffocation. To avoid dying of asphyxiation within minutes, the condemned is forced into an almost superhuman effort. He must push down against the nail driven through his feet, which in itself causes devastating pain, and thrust his body upward. Only by raising himself can he release the diaphragm and expel the trapped air. It is here that the biblical account acquires a medically staggering dimension. Jesus spoke 7 sentences from the cross. For the physician, each one of those sentences was an act of will that defies medical explanation. To speak a single word, Jesus had to push down on his wounded feet, extend his arms with their crushed nerves, and lift his body high enough to draw sufficient oxygen to vibrate his vocal cords. Every sentence was literally to feel the pain of crucifixion again from the beginning. And yet, Christ chose to endure that physical agony again and again, so that his final words could be heard. After 3 hours of agony, Jesus dies. To confirm death, a Roman soldier drives a lance into his side. The Gospel of John registers that at the moment of the piercing, blood and water immediately flowed out. Pierre, drawing of his expertise in thoracic surgery, explains the phenomenon. The prolonged state of shock, the asphyxiation, and the extreme physical stress had caused what medicine identifies as pericardial effusion and pleural effusion. The water described is actually the transparent fluid that had accumulated around the heart and lungs as a result of clinical collapse. When the lance pierced the thorax, it passed through these pockets of fluid before reaching the heart, which still contained blood. Jesus died from multiple organ failure, culminating in cardiac rupture or terminal asphyxiation. The broken heart was far from being a theological figure of speech. It was a physiological reality. The investigation of Dr. Pierre Barbet permanently changed the way we look at Good Friday. He removed the passion from the realm of the abstract and placed it in the reality of flesh and blood. What we have described here is the outer limit of human endurance. But throughout history, countless men and women looked upon this same sacrifice and decided that their own lives should be a reflection of that surrender. Stories like that of Paul of Tarsus, who went from hunting Christians to one of his greatest defenders in history, or Peter, who went from denying Christ 3 times to become the first leader of his church. And you can find these stories in our channel. Give them a go, like them, share them, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. And if you want to stay ahead of our releases, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. More stories like Christ's, Paul's, or Peter's are coming, and you won't want to miss them.